Welcome, Dr. Ruben Cordova, to the EPCC Chicano Studies Platicas series. Thank you for coming. How did you first become interested in the visual arts and Chicano art?
Well, I was interested in the visual arts when I was a child. I took classes through junior high. Didn't really have a lot of exposure to art in general. I grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. There weren't art museums there. My family would think nothing of driving to Denver and visiting the Natural History Museum to look at the dinosaur bones or to go shopping, but it never occurred to anyone to go to an art museum, although I was really obsessed with Van Gogh. I wanted to see a real Van Gogh. I thought, what would it be like to see, a real Van Gogh and to see the actual texture of the paint and how thick it really was and the effects of the light and the colors. And I didn't go to an art museum until I attended college. I went to Brown University. I visited the RISD Museum, I think the first day I got there. And, I saw Impressionism and Post-Impressionism and Old Masters and American paintings and classical art and Asian art. And I really liked just about everything. And I decided that, I would travel as much as I could after that and see as many museums as I could. And so I went to Europe the year after my freshman year, went to maybe 15 or 20 countries, all the major museums in those countries, and I moved to New York after graduating from Brown, and I went to galleries and museums almost every day for certain periods when work allowed it. And so I was very interested especially in Renaissance and Baroque art, and eventually I thought, well, I like traveling so much, I like art so much, I probably should go into art history, so I have a rationale for doing this, and some free time too, because you get the long vacations and hopefully an occasional sabbatical. So I did my PhD at Berkeley, and I think came to Chicano art last, although I helped somebody do a mural of Che Guevara on the swimming pool wall when I was a kid, but really all I did was carry the buckets of paint, and I think he did all the painting. And I said, well, he's a medical doctor. Didn't tell him who Che Guevara was, or it probably would have gotten painted over right away. And it actually stayed there a long time. I remember seeing it for, some years. So that was an early exposure to Chicano art, and I saw drawings and certain things, but there wasn't much in the way of paintings growing up. And I saw some Latino art in New York, not a great deal of Chicano art. There were still very few Mexicans or Chicanos in New York at that time. I think that's changed quite a bit now. And it was really at Berkeley, when I was in graduate school, that finally I was able to offer a course in Mexican art, and I thought, well, I'm going to sneak some Chicano art into this course. I mean, I don't think Chicano art was really on their radar, and they wouldn't have approved a class on Chicano art, but Mexican art, because, there are 4 Rivera murals in the Bay Area, and Rivera was an important cubist, and everyone acknowledges him as a great draftsman, even if they don't like his murals or if they don't like the other muralists. So I went to Mexico and I studied murals and other things there, pre-Columbian art. And I also got to know a number of Chicano artists in the Bay Area. And so I did a class that was on Mexican and Chicano art, or a couple of classes. And so that's when I really began investigating Chicano art as really a scholarly discipline.
Why do you think Chicano art is an important area of study today?
Well, I think it's very important. It's vibrant. The work is very powerful. The work says a lot of important things about our society, about our culture. I think it's an important part of the American story, and it's something separate and discrete from Latin America or from Mexico, something different from, say, the Santero tradition in New Mexico, although there are certain points of contact and shared histories and things that we have in common. So I think that the art itself is powerful. The art itself is important. The art itself is something that belongs in studies of American art or in courses on American art. At the same time, there's some specialized areas that to really investigate in detail, you really need separate courses, that it's a complex history with the Chicano movement and the concomitant rise of Chicano art. As part of that movement, it is a big story and something that, I think requires specialization in ethnic studies or Chicano studies or other areas.
What was the role of the Mexican muralists in shaping Chicano art?
Well, I guess I had assumed initially that it was directly more important than it was, but when I actually talked to a lot of the first Chicano artists, a lot of them didn't have that much exposure to it, or maybe they liked one of the murals, maybe they liked Orozco and didn't much care for Rivera. Now, there are some exceptions. There's actually some artists who went to study with the Siqueiros studio in Mexico because it was still going, whether he was alive or dead. I know Ray Patlan, Judith Baca went, but it was after Siqueiros had died, I believe, but the workshop was still going. So they actually studied with, the studio or with the master. There are some Chicano artists who studied in Mexico City in universities. Luis Jimenez, Mel Casas were among those artists who actually took courses and were formally enrolled in a university. So they had obviously that experience of seeing all these works, the mosaics, the murals, the pre-Columbian monuments or the ruins that remained, the anthropology museum, churches and other colonial things. There are other artists like, say, Rupert Garcia, who actually taught art history and really taught himself, the whole history of Mexico from the Olmecs on, and did, intensive study of the muralists, and he did many tributes to all of the muralists, portraits of them, and various homages to their work. So there are some artists who had, very great and direct knowledge of this work. Somebody like Enrique Chagoya, who's, a fairly recent immigrant to the United States, of course, grew up with all of that, even though, a lot of artists were doing abstract art in Mexico. And maybe when they came to the United States and decided that they would identify as Chicanos, they went back to doing Figaro work. And maybe the muralists then became more important to them, whereas in Mexico it was, it was considered old-fashioned. So there's quite a bit of variability. So I've emphasized the artists who really had a direct connection or who made a concerted effort to go and study Mexican art and the muralists. At the same time, a lot of artists, they might have seen a reproduction in a Chicano magazine that's not very, very high quality, or a Chicano newspaper. I think that's really one of the main sources for information. Cartoons and drawings after works of art, or not very good quality black and white reproductions. You have to realize that there wasn't much literature available. That because of the Cold War and the Red Scare, it was anathema to treat Mexican art. People were afraid of it. There's a pretty famous anecdote about a family in New York. They had a painting, it's a portable mural by Rivera, had all these communists holding hands. And there's a story that, people would walk in the door, see the red stars, and the communists, they'd walk out and never come back because, they were afraid the FBI or the CIA would follow them around if they liked Mexican art a little too much. And it's something that was not taught in the schools. There were almost no books in English on them. There wasn't that great a literature in Spanish, and libraries didn't have them. And often Chicanos didn't attend the absolute top universities that really had, every book on every subject. So this is not something that it was easy to find. I've asked artists like Yolanda Lopez, well, what effect did the Mexican artists have on you? And she said, well, I didn't really know much. One day I found a Siqueiros book in a remainder pile, and if I hadn't found that, I wouldn't really have had much exposure to the range of their work. And she herself, doesn't really know that much about them, I think. I gave her a text of a lecture on that I gave on Catholic iconography and artists who were using Catholic iconography to critique Catholicism. And after she read that, she said, well, I have a lot more respect for Rivera than I did before. I didn't really know he did this sort of thing. So I was actually surprised that a lot of Chicano artists didn't really know very much of the history and had a very limited exposure to the images themselves. You also have to remember that they painted so much that if you didn't go to Mexico, or if you don't have a catalog raisonné of every detail of major murals, you're really missing a lot. There's just so much there. They covered so much acreage that to pick out a point you might want to use or that might influence you, you have to go through a whole lot to see those things that you might want.
Why do you think Chicano artists are often excluded from art history courses?